Hey everybody, welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Assistant Professor of Communication and Media at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on Twitter at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. In this episode, we're going to mix it up a bit and talk about data journalism, and in particular, how data journalists are using social media data to report about politics. And my guest to discuss this is Aleszu Bajak. He is a senior data reporter at USA Today and is part of the paper's National Investigative Unit. So he does a lot of computational analysis on things like congressional tweets or messages on Parler and 4chan to see how conspiracy theories spread over into politicians' tweets or mainstream news coverage. So those sound like the questions that we often talk about on this podcast from recently published academic studies, but instead there's also, I think, an increasing trend for newspapers to have their in-house computational journalists who are working with similar questions, but under different circumstances and with a different goal. And that goal being to appeal to a broad readership by providing some analysis that either drives a story on its own or helps to provide context on a larger story. For example, Aleszu worked on a piece where it was framed around critical race theory and the kind of rise of this contested topic, where Aleszu had traced the development of the term in mainstream news outlets, particularly their television coverage, and then switching more to an episodic frame focused specifically on Glenn Youngkin's gubernatorial race, where by doing some analysis on the speeches in the week before that election, you can see that schools and critical race theory were mentioned just as much as the state of Virginia itself, and even more so than taxes. So using different types of computational analysis on different types of data, I think both Aleszu and a lot of the researchers in political communication and political science are working on the same questions, using similar methods, but operating under different conditions and again, with different goals. So that's really what this episode is about. I was curious to find out more about how data journalists are selecting the stories on social media and politics they report, what type of analysis they're doing, and then how are they thinking about communicating the results of those analysis in a way that's engaging and tells a story either in print or through visuals. Remember that USA Today is the third largest newspaper by circulation in the United States, so you have to appeal to a broad audience. And I think that academics can learn something by thinking more deeply about how can we communicate our results in a more popularized manner. And Aleszu is particularly qualified to talk about these differences between journalism and academia because he worked previously as a lab scientist in gene therapy and also was a science journalist for 10 years. So he knows research design, he knows the importance of the intricacies of methods and reporting things correctly, and he's also in constant dialogue with experts as he's writing his stories. So that's all to say that we won't cover too much of the top-line results of Aleszu's work. We will a little bit, but if you're interested in things like fringe platforms, conspiracy theories, and how congressional leaders are communicating with rhetoric, definitely check out the episode description. I'll put some links to stories there, as well as Aleszu's website, where he publishes a lot of his work, as well as some accompanying visuals. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Aleszu Bajak. Again, he is a senior data reporter at USA Today. Aleszu, thanks for taking the time out and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thank you so much for the invite. I've been a long-time listener.
Wonderful. So you've been doing a bunch of great projects that use computational social science methods to report political news stories. And I want to dive into some of those projects later on in the episode. But first, I'd like to get your thoughts on data journalism more broadly. Why don't we start with the outlet, USA Today? Can you tell us a little bit about USA Today's approach to data journalism and how it might differ from other news outlets?
So we have a few different desks or teams that do data journalism, and that varies, from our graphics team that's, constantly maybe pulling down data from APIs or scraping dashboards and building their own data sets, and then of course visualizing those, to teams like mine, which, for lack of a better name, is named the data team. And so the data team at USA Today is embedded at the investigations team. And so that means that the 8 of us are kind of embedded into individual long-term investigations, and then also do kind of medium and short-term pieces on kind of more of an ad hoc kind of pitching basis. And in terms of our approach, I'd say, we help, reporters through dealing with or requesting structured data, right? Like your Excel spreadsheets, or tracking down specific numbers that are going to kind of help illustrate a story, through to what the data team is kind of specialized in, which is statistical analyses that kind of undergird bigger projects and kind of bigger investigations. And what that means is everything from Poisson regressions modeling nursing home deaths during COVID, through to social media analysis using network analysis tools and NLP methods. So that's the kind of wide range of data expertise that we bring to the news organization.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of using computational analysis, it's being adopted by quite a few news outlets, but I'm curious specifically about USA Today because I've seen it pop up a lot more in academic presentations. In the past, it's been, here's the Times, which is going to be your left-wing outlet, and here's Fox or Wall Street Journal is going to be your right-wing outlet. But I've seen a lot more inclusion of USA Today in studies because it seems to be more kind of neutral. And I wonder, is there a particular type of reader that USA Today appeals to? I mean, I know it has a broad audience, but is there kind of something in the audience or the messaging that maybe sets USA Today apart from more partisan outlets?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think the paper has obviously really wide reach, and in the USA Today network, there are over 200 newspapers, right, regional and local. And so we have this kind of broad audience across the nation, which is really cool. And it's even in the tagline, America's newspaper, when it launched now 40 years ago. But I'm not sure how to think about the audience in a kind of distinct way from those other outlets you cite. I think in terms of the way that we approach our stories is, what needs to be told and what's the best way to tell it. So I'm really glad that you're seeing, more and more kind of USA Today reporting cited out there, and then data analyses too.
Yeah, definitely. I think the idea is that it's kind of aimed at this more general audience that's not necessarily super partisan or looking for a particular bias. But I watched a presentation that you gave earlier this year for the National Press Foundation, where you talked about your thinking and workflow when working with computational methods and data. And I found that super interesting. And I want to pick up on a couple points that you discussed there. But I think it's helpful for the listeners if we get a little bit of a background into your context. How did you get into data journalism? And in particular, how did you learn to code?
So learning to code started in the mid 90s, building websites and stuff like that. And then it lay dormant for a while. I was in gene therapy. I was a lab scientist, trying to build viruses and test them. And I eventually left the lab and wanted to kind of break into science writing. And I was a science reporter for about a decade. And really only 5 years ago, I was kind of falling in love with a lot of those data visualizations that we see, right? I mean, like you cite, the New York Times with these beautiful, scrolly telling kind of visualizations where you're pulled through the story. I was teaching journalism, had basically no business teaching journalism, but what I was doing was learning what the latest tools and the kind of new frontiers were in digital storytelling and digital presentation, and data skills really formed a large part of that and a large part of my curriculum. And through that, I was teaching myself so that I could then teach my students. And so I was learning how to really visualize. I mean, visuals was my way into this field in terms of using computational social science techniques. I was really inspired by the digital humanists, right? So I learned my R skills from English PhD students at Northeastern. You can believe that. Shout out to Fitz and Sarah Connell, who's working at the libraries there too. So sorry, I'm rambling, but it was kind of this surveying the field, trying to read widely, not just look at what journalism was doing, but try to be inspired by design, information design and visualization. The Information is Beautiful awards. Pull from all these strands and think about how those things could better, support the storytelling that we were doing in journalism.
Yeah, and I mean, your current work recently has been focused a lot on things like Parler and how conspiracy theories spread through 4chan. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned just now, but also in your talk, that you were really inspired by digital humanities and the storytelling behind those literature and, as you said, English PhDs. And so I'm wondering how that connects from, on the one hand, the kind of hardcore political work that you're doing, but being inspired originally by more liberal arts type of endeavors with this computational analysis.
Yeah. I mean, I think I saw a lot of commonalities in the approach to the research questions from a lot of those researchers in academia and what I was trying to do, which was maybe not that story that I'm going to turn around in a week, right? I mean, seldom have I been a breaking news reporter, from working at Science Friday as a producer, working on a weekly talk radio show, to being a freelance magazine reporter. I had a lot more time to kind of incubate an idea and think about what a feature story might look like around an issue. And I think that that's also been the way that I approach data analyses, which is really a very luxurious perspective in terms of time. And so looking at the way that academics approach a certain problem or use or assemble a particular data set to answer that question, that's the way that I've been trying to approach my stories. So I tend to get really excited when I stumble upon kind of a multivariate data set on state level policies, for instance, just because I think about the ways that we could kind of use that and interrogate that for specific questions on how culture has shifted or how policies have shifted, not just at the pace of a news cycle, right, or even the pace of one congressional term, but in thinking about how do we paint this picture and contextualize this in terms of policies in a specific state over decades, for instance.
Right. And I want to get more into the nitty gritty of the data. But first, I want to ask you about your kind of thought process and approach towards picking ideas to report on. So you've done some work recently on how critical race theory was reported in the news, congressional reactions to the Supreme Court's ruling. So clearly kind of recent and controversial topics have news value, right? But what goes into the thought process of picking stories and then how to approach them computationally as well?
Well, generally it starts with either reacting to the news or, one of the reporters on the team having a kind of an itch, right? There's something that's been bothering them that they really want to tell a story about. And for us for example, the critical race theory, this was quantifying and showing the spread of that as a talking point, right? As an idea that was being injected from conservative circles into the mainstream media, and at how many times that was attempted. So that wasn't obviously the pitch, right? The pitch or the kind of early brainstorm was, what can we tell that's distinct, right? What can we do that's going to push the story forward that isn't replicating what another outlets or other reporters are doing? And to us, the question really was, how did this become weaponized, right? And what was the language that surrounded that phrase, critical race theory, that allowed it to kind of be so popular and attractive for folks to kind of repeat, right? And really kind of glom onto, right? Attach to it all these other sentiments and all these other kind of ideas that really had nothing to do with that legal framework, right, as it was envisioned. And so that was the way that we then started to assemble data that might help us answer that question. So what was the framing? What was the kind of associated rhetoric and messaging with critical race theory? And how did that change over time? And we saw it changing from kind of a backlash to woke culture through to, federal employee training, which is when activists got Donald Trump to actually issue an executive order on those trainings, and then through to Glenn Youngkin's campaign and it becoming attached to schools, right, through K through 12, and then of course higher education too. That snowballing was something that we approached from a kind of temporal and a data perspective. So we said, well, there's got to be a way that we can show that, because it really was a snowball effect.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's really interesting how you can look at this from so many different angles. Like you have the kind of broad media reporting about this term, so kind of tracking it in the media over time. In academia, that would be like one study, and then you kind of follow it through to a specific case, Glenn Youngkin's gubernatorial race and his speeches, which in academia wouldn't be part of one study, right? Because they're two. In telling the story, you can show that kind of broad angle down into a concrete case, which I think is super interesting.
Well, we're playing fast and loose, right, with these approaches and our timelines. And the one thing I should mention is, it's not the first time I've used the technique, right? So when I'm ready enough to pitch it or to publish with it, it generally isn't the first time I've used something like sentiment analysis or even, a specific kind of R package. But the other thing I mean to say by all this is I am running these analyses by computer scientists for kind of specific stuff, or political scientists that use NLP methods, or network scientists that may help me understand how to not so much model the network effects, but talk about them and characterize things appropriately. So that part of the workflow is always there. And that gives me confidence in using those techniques. But that is a feedback loop, right, where I'm constantly seeking feedback, sure, reinforcement and validation, but I'm also trying to get at, okay, well, who else has done similar work to this that I should cite? And if you read through my stories, there's a bit of a kind of, literature review, or kind of a citation flow there that I'm proud of, because it's definitely not happening in isolation. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, right? Of other folks in academia that are doing this work. I'm just playing, as I say, fast and loose and trying to do it kind of on a quicker basis. I mean, looking at the Glenn Youngkin campaign speeches in the last week before his election, that was saying, well, I know how to look for every mention of schools or CRT or teachers or students, right? That's just a list of words. The harder part was saying, let me go to YouTube, pull the closed captioning for every one of those speeches, and then search through that text, right? And then quickly visualize that basically as a histogram. So that thing took really only a couple days of work to build, but I had been incubating those ideas and those real basic NLP approaches for years, really.
Mm-hmm. And so you are getting this kind of expedited peer review by leaning on experts and saying, is this the way to interpret this, or do you have any suggestions for how to better explain this, or something like that?
Yeah, well, and a lot of them will say, "Listen, this works for your application. If this were in a journal, you'd probably have to do X, Y, and Z in terms of cross validation and all of that." And I get that, but I think that we understand each other in terms of the context. But no, I try to get it. I try to get it as right as I can, and that, call it expedited peer review, or really just calling on these folks who are very generous with their time to help me understand things as minute, right? As how do I do this specific calculation in terms of normalized frequency or something, right? Really basic questions of numerators and denominators. That's what I'm bothering them on, right? And so I appreciate this. And if they have work and want to be quoted, right, that they can be in the story. But there's, of course, for every one source that's quoted in a story, I probably have 3 or 4 that have helped me either understand the topic or literally help me with the mechanics of using those methods.
Yeah. And I want to get more into the kind of differences that you have with the newsroom and deadlines. But first, I want to talk a little bit about data collection, because your team is part of USA Today's National Investigative Unit. So I'm assuming that you need to do, some type of proactive work. I know you mentioned in your talk these freedom of information requests, and I think maybe academics could do a little more work with that. But can you tell us how the process goes in terms of collecting data? And you also mentioned merging different types of data sets to get context to a story is important. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, data collection, there are so many different resources and websites out there that are packaged some data sets in a kind of simple format, really easy to pull down. Those are great to revisit and to think about in terms of contextualizing. You're rarely going to find breaking news out of a data set that everyone has, right? And so what we're always thinking about, and especially through COVID and reporting on really the lack of data and the lack of understanding in terms of equity and who was being affected and where those inequities were, was thinking about, well, how do we systematically collect the data set that we could use to answer those questions? And so one example would be the vaccine rollout. So there were very little kind of metadata attached to things that we could get on vaccines. So for instance, in terms of the public, we weren't understanding where vaccines were being sent. We weren't understanding the breakdown by race, by age, by county of where vaccines were being administered. And so it became a strategy. We worked out a strategy of sending freedom of information requests to every state and, of course, every kind of federal agency involved and requesting data. And not just requesting kind of, hey, give us all the data you have on COVID vaccinations. What we actually did, and I learned a ton about this from my editor, was the way to do enough research and homework and talk to folks that really kind of assemble those data sets to understand the structure of what it looks like and how literally it would be exported by this agency at the federal level or state health department. And then make your request that specific in terms of literally naming what you want on the rows and what you want on the columns and how you want that exported, through which dates and all of that. So that became a very kind of interesting way of how you interact with the administrative state to extract what's should be public knowledge that they just were not publishing. And so that's what we did. And I think you're right to say FOIAs are underutilized, I think, by everyone. I mean, you tend to associate it with journalists, or at least I was. But I think I saw this study once. Journalists account for maybe a third or less than a third of all FOIA requests. The majority come from lawyers, kind of in trying to assemble their lawsuits and argument. I would love to see more academics using that. And here's for a public health story that I did in comparing Minnesota to Michigan's vaccine rollout. The reason I chose those two states was really random because they were the only two that responded to that barrage of FOIA requests to all 50 states and gave me data that I could actually compare. They gave me the apples to apples, which was one vaccine per row, and giving me the breakdowns in terms of county and where these people were from and their age and their race. That should have been something a lot easier to collect. But in terms of what that could inspire, I mean, I was talking to public health researchers who had been looking at inequities in the vaccine rollout, and they didn't have that kind of data, right? They weren't getting that from states. They lamented that no one was going to be able to do that kind of analysis, even after the pandemic, finally was close to ending, because no one had that data and no one had that kind of systematic strategy for how to extract it from these state health departments. And by the time it got up to the federal level, it was already being kind of married and normalized and standardized. So that's, I think, a place that we could, all work together, and maybe academics and journalists together, in thinking, hey, how do we strategize on FOIAs? And actually, Jeremy Singer Vine, who runs this great newsletter called Data is Plural, he just started a new data liberation project. That's literally what it's called. And so that's going to be a kind of systematic way of thinking about what data sets should be, fought for, cleaned, and then made open to the public. And so that's called dataliberationproject.org.
Interesting. I was just thinking, I mean, in the social media research, we're all kind of lamenting like, oh, we can't get this data. Well, what are we going to do? Well, we might go run a survey or something instead. But I don't think anyone really thinks about, well, maybe there's a freedom of information request. I could ask a government agency about X, Y, or Z. Like, it's just not something that at least I've come across in presentations or even being taught as a student. Like, hey, here's how you do one. Here's what they can offer. So I think it's cool that you're going through. And for COVID vaccinations, for example, you might be able to get Michigan and Minnesota, but then you can also, to look at the inequities, pull in other forms of data, right? Like from the labor statistics or the census, and starting to merge and build a bigger picture.
Yeah, and that merging is something that I learned early on is where you differentiate, right, that data set from what others may have, right? If everyone has the same data set, like for instance, what Health and Human Services was publishing, the height of the pandemic on hospitalizations, okay, well, every newsroom has that. And many academics were using that too. In fact, speaking of the academics I rely on to help, I had some folks at the Harvard School of Public Health helping me literally figure out which columns in that HHS data set I should be, dividing, right, using as my denominator, which was great. I mean, those were folks who were then publishing papers on that stuff. So I felt like I was having my hand held by the right people. But merging, right? I mean, one of the first steps that we really take with anything, especially if it has a geographic component, is to bring in census data, right? Automatically, you can start doing like Public Health 101, the Epidemiology 101 stuff, right? Which is saying, well, let's look at incidence, for instance, right? Let's look at per capita rates. Let's look at breakdowns by race. Let's look at breakdowns by age. So bringing in those kinds of extra data sets, merging them in and thinking about, well, what story now is untold because we finally brought these two things together. That's usually very ripe for story ideas.
And keeping on the idea of data, I think a lot of our listeners will be familiar with the idea of getting to know your data, kind of just looking at a spreadsheet, going through the different rows and columns, et cetera. But you mentioned in your talk that when you're exploring data, like calculating averages of a particular column, you're constantly translating those numbers in your head into a sentence. And I'm curious to hear more about that. Can you describe this kind of translating numbers into text in your head in more detail? I think it might be helpful for some of the listeners out there doing these types of analyses.
Yeah. So one thing that it's hard to grasp, I think, for any person is really big numbers, right? Especially when it comes to wealth, for instance, like what does $100 million look like, or what does it buy you? What does, I covered the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, right? Like what does X Olympic-sized swimming pools of oil actually mean? And I remember even back then translating that into how much of the Empire State Building would be filled up with oil if that were the container, right? And it was something like 60 floors, right? So 60 stories worth of oil. To me, that was easier to visualize than Olympic-sized swimming pools. And so that's what I'm thinking about. I'm not always doing a good job, but when I'm coming upon a number, right, that's my conclusion, right? The insight from this analysis is that, we found, for instance, on a big child welfare investigation into adoptions, right? We found this number of 66,000 children whose adoptions dissolved, right? They failed. And then those children wound up in the state's care, right? They wound up in foster care. So 66,000 is a big number, but we also had a time frame, right? This happened since '08. So then, and this is my colleague Marissa was really great at helping us just package this up. You can just simply divide that by as many days as are in our time period. And now we're talking about 12 children's adoptions a day are failing. And those children are winding up in foster care. That put, I think, a lot more of a punch behind the number, right? Because now we're not talking about some hard figure, which isn't even that crazy of an idea, 66,000, but we're putting it in terms of number of children a day in the country whose idea of a fairy tale adoption is just disrupting and they're ending up in foster care.
Yeah, it's interesting. And it kind of gets to the communication side of disseminating these results, which I want to get to. Just after I ask you about these kind of newsroom differences, I'm very interested in terms of, you're not working with deadlines that are as long as writing a PhD dissertation or publishing a research article, for example. And you also have an editor that oversees your work. So can you talk a little bit about how deadlines and the hierarchy of the newsroom interacts with your reporting?
So it's always great, right? I mean, they are they're folks backstopping this analysis, right? So, in many cases, I may go do an expedited, call it peer review, but it's really not, right? Run my analysis or my code by a few researchers, even if they're coming back and saying, hey, tweak this or this looks good. I have editors that are also fluent in looking through statistical analysis and code and help point out, well, why is it that you did that, right? Or what do maybe not the subject matter experts who use a specific statistical method, but what are the statisticians saying about employing this kind of method? And so then that's really helpful in terms of guiding this work, getting extra validation. In terms of the newsroom structure, I mean, we have great ideas coming from everywhere, right? And so, like, as much as all of us reporters can pitch and are expected to kind of bring a lot of ideas to the table, we are always getting great ideas coming from the top, right? And sometimes not so great ideas that we get to push back against or quickly maybe contest with data and say, actually, look, this isn't borne out in the data. Why don't we look at this instead? But for instance, the Parler analysis came from my editors, where they were just wondering on January 6th, what's the social media chatter look like, right? And not on Twitter or Facebook, but they were wondering too on these fringe platforms. And it hadn't crystallized in my head that that could have been a story until I got that seemingly general kind of question come to me from my editors. So that was great, and that ended up being a really cool story.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I love about this type of data journalism is that I'm sure some academics had the same idea, but we won't see that paper for another year and a half. So we can get these kind of insights pretty rapidly in terms of what's happening. And it's nice to have some computational analysis behind it. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that, the Parler project?
Yeah, so the Parler project, again, standing on the shoulders of giants. So Jeremy Blackburn at Binghamton and his group that had published both a bunch of awesome work on Pepe the Frog and 4chan and other boards, but also a toolkit called the Social Media Analysis Toolkit, so smat-app.com. They've put that together, and it's this awesome kind of one-stop shop for understanding chatter, right? You can do keyword search, you can look for sample posts, you can look at, chatter on 4chan, Telegram, the Donald, the .win forums, and all these kinds of kind of fringe or alternative sites. They have tons of different sites up there. So what they do is they kind of sample at various levels of comprehensiveness from those boards, so that you can kind of ask questions of how much, for instance, the term FBI after like the Mar-a-Lago search was being used across these different platforms. So back in the days after January 6th, I was talking a lot with Jeremy and his team, getting early access to that API, and was pulling down Parler data that they had been pulling. And this, is an in tandem effort. I mean, I know ProPublica and the New York Times were also doing some awesome work with Parler data, specifically around videos and stuff that was being shared there. But my approach was going to be purely textual and trying to gather the largest data set of Parler posts that I could, break it down literally to that day, look for just January 6th, and then we zoomed it in even more to kind of the hours before and hours after Donald Trump's speech. And really, we even zoomed it in, and this is crazy to think about, I'm sure, as academics, is, you're going to lose a lot of volume if you're zooming into a time period of a few hours, right? That's not necessarily going to make for a good paper. But what we were examining really was, what was the effect? And be careful not to kind of draw any causality here, but what was the effect of Donald Trump's kind of calls to march on the Capitol and fight like hell, and you're not going to take your country back with weakness? All of that kind of rhetoric that happened at the ellipse in that speech, what was the effect in the next minutes and hours on Parler? And what we saw was a spike in calls to civil war. And so seeing that, kind of validating it and verifying it, to be true mathematically, right, which is the whole fairly rudimentary, but like that's the basic text analysis that we were doing, became the kind of the backbone of the story, right? And so then we were able to color the story in with, well, some examples of what were those Parler posts, what was that rhetoric sounding like, and then also using this kind of narrative strategy, which is a TikTok, right, where we're breaking down kind of minute by minute what Trump's speech is saying, and then jumping over to Parler and citing what was being said there. So that's, you can see how, I mean, at least the way that we assemble those kinds of stories is a constant kind of juxtaposition of these two kind of streams, right? In one case, you have something very visible too, right? I mean, kind of an outgoing president and the speech versus the platform that we're examining, juxtaposing them together and then doing a constant kind of zoom in and zoom out.
Yeah, and I'll link down to that story in the episode description so interested listeners can go and read about it in more detail. But I think it brings us to this idea of communication and storytelling when translating these results. As you said, kind of positioning Trump's speech against the Parler posts and kind of building a context around it. And you mentioned in the talk that I keep referring to, that I'll also link to, that simplification is important, and the responsibility to your readers is more important to you than kind of pleasing the Twitterati out there on the interweb. So can you discuss how simplification factors into your reporting and maybe how not to oversimplify stories in a way that might distort their complexity?
Yeah, that's a tough balance to strike. I think that comes from, well, so first I've written for a lot of different publications in terms of their audiences, right? Like I've written for Biotechniques, which was a kind of methods journal. And so that's very kind of highly jargoned, like very almost esoteric kind of look at laboratory methods, right? Using GFP in your, analysis of cells. It's been so many years since I did that kind of work. But that's like super specialized audiences. And I think the more and more I've worked in journalism and now at a newspaper, the more you have to say, well, who is actually going to be able to not understand, right? I mean, I think it's bad to approach this in any kind of lens that might be misconstrued as condescending, right? But in a kind of, how are the most people going to be able to engage with this? And so, right off the bat, it's, well, how do we drop some of that jargon? How do we make sure that we are really kind of justifying why someone should pay attention to this thing? And so right off the bat, you have a contextualization of why this matters, right? And then, of course, dropping as much of that jargon as possible. So in the case of the storytelling, that may be, well, using a lot of examples, right? I mean, even folks that don't necessarily do journalism or know much about it, they may know the term anecdotal lead. So like you may be doing a story on COVID hospitalizations or misinformation on social media, and you may want to paint a picture or set a scene. And I think of it almost from, this has been the way that I learned it, and from a cinematography perspective, right? Like, what's that wide angle shot? Who's that character walking across the camera, right? Like, in that case, you may want to kind of translate that narratively and say, what are the examples that I can kind of pepper in here at the top? What's the scene that I could set that's going to draw readers in immediately? And then the 1-2 punch is to, right off that scene, explain to them why this matters, right? Why are we paying attention to this? Why are we making a kind of big to-do about this? So that's, narrative and then the kind of justification components.
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm thinking it's essentially a hook, right? You want to get readers engaged so that they take the information and understand kind of implicitly why it's important.
Yeah, and that's what we try to do, and that's definitely what we lean on our editors to do too, right? Because so much of the time we are in the weeds and we think it's super important. What I'm saying is, once you are super specialized in your field, you may find that super interesting, but it may be helpful to test it out on someone who has no idea what that is and try to repackage or kind of reframe this to appeal to your Aunt Linda, for instance, right? I think it's a good exercise, and I think it's something that we are constantly having to do because our editors say, hey, they're going to play dumb with us. Explain it to me like I'm 5.
Right, right. I think it's so important to do that periodically with any project, academia or journalism. But one thing that really helps with that is visualizations and interactive visualizations. And you've done some really cool work there where you really get to play with those kind of camera shots through interactive visualizations. And so you recently published a project that analyzed 2.8 congressional tweets to chart the increasing polarization and emotionalization of political rhetoric over time. And there's a nice interactive chart that kind of shows this partisan sorting. And I want to ask you about the kind of creation and thinking behind visual storytelling. But first, could you tell us about the motivations for studying these congressional tweets, as well as what you found?
Yeah. So it was 2.8 million, not 2.8.
Oh, sorry.
which is good, right? We want to make sure it's a large enough data set.
Indeed.
Yeah. so the motivation and the inspiration came from actually I was in Vienna this summer, and I spent 4 weeks at the Complexity Science Hub, and I was able to interact with a lot of political scientists and psychologists and network scientists who were looking at things like, well, complexity science broadly, but using network science tools, using NLP and those kinds of techniques to understand things like misinformation on social media or these psychological aspects of misinformation, for instance, and also political communication or political speech. And so in this case, I had been meeting a lot with Jana Lasser and David Garcia. They were at TU Graz in Austria. And they have been doing some really cool work on looking at things like, well, the NewsGuard ratings associated with domains shared by US politicians. They actually just published a study looking at, I think it's US and UK politicians and the kinds of news articles that they're sharing and the trustworthiness of those news sites. They've also kind of assembled data like this, right, on all of Congress in the last 10 years and looking at questions like that. So I was very inspired by the work that they were doing. And what I had been doing kind of in parallel was looking at the midterms. And so I had about 1,200 or 1,500 congressional candidates on the campaign trail, their social media feeds, right? So what they were saying on Twitter and what they were saying on Facebook. And it's an interesting way to look at how, those folks on the campaign trail are talking about immigration or they're talking about inflation or abortion. But what I was interested in doing was exploring them rhetorically in terms of how they are segregating into different bubbles. And it's something that you can see on the campaign trail, right? Like the way that we kind of framed it was who is sounding the most like Marjorie Taylor Greene versus who is sounding the most like AOC on the campaign trail. So that's interesting. Like, who are you campaigning in the mold of? And that actually tended to cluster these folks fairly well together, right? Because they're using the same kinds of words, right? Southern border crisis. I mean, that's not something AOC is going to say. That's something that the MTGs and those folks are going to say. And so what I was then thinking about was, well, how do we do this? But maybe we could do this for 10 years of Congress. And really simply using those kinds of clustering methods, in this case, hierarchical clustering, to Congress by Congress, right, from the 112th to the 117th Congress, look at the tweets that these legislators were sending and really kind of map out how those tweets used to be a lot more bipartisan, for lack of a better word, a lot more overlap in the literal language, to a lot more distinct, right? To the point that in the last 2 years, there's very little overlap, at least from this clustering method. And so then we were animating that. My colleague Ramon Padilla did an amazing job in kind of helping us zoom in and zoom out, right? We're abstracting to a visual that kind of looks like this beautiful dendrogram, right? And borrowing from evolutionary biology and these kind of clades that where these different species, right? These political species have kind of evolved into. And then zooming in, annotating those tweets to show where the overlap among bipartisan clusters, what that looked like in terms of literal words, voters, veterans, these kinds of words. And then through those 10 years, showing that this has become more and more polarized. And then, of course, is all the context of this lines up. And if you read the piece, there's a lot of citation of effective polarization work and other kinds of political speech work that looks at polarization. And of course, other kinds of work looking at, roll call voting and other ways that we talk about polarization.
Yeah, it makes so much more sense to the story when you can scroll down and you're seeing these bubbles kind of move and have the pop-up examples from the tweets, which is something you just can't do in a static paper, right? You have this kind of interactive form. And so can you talk about the importance of visuals in communicating your results? And I guess, on the one hand, you have this kind of interactive scrolling type of visual format, but then there's also the visuals that are in a story, right? The pictures. So how do you see the difference between those as well?
It's always hard to choose which will go in the piece and which you have to leave on the cutting room floor. I for sure make dozens of charts, especially for an analysis like this. This was like a 2-month project, but we have some guiding principles, right? Like one thing is you want those charts to kind of be understandable almost at a glance, right? So these kind of principles of data visualization that I was learning 5 years ago when I was teaching it, I've tried to embody those, right? Which is, are these the most effective ways to present this data? Is this information pushing forward the story or kind of allowing us to get kind of insight into this phenomenon, right? That may be hard to achieve, strictly with words, right? And I do love that idea of a picture or a visualization being worth 1,000 words. And sometimes that means simplification for sure. I do lots of line charts. I do lots of histograms. That sometimes is all we need. I can't tell you how many maps of the US we've killed, right? That just like doesn't work. And so that idea of space to ink ratio, right? Or ink to information ratio, we think about that. But in the case of something like Congress and 2.8 million tweets, you have to abstract it, right? And you have to abstract it in a way that's also, I think, visually appealing. You can't say the same about a lot of academic figures in papers, but at the same time, they have a different goal in mind. I wish I could barrage my readers with, histograms and R-squared values and scatter plots, like to undergird what it is that I'm presenting. But I'm hoping that, well, maybe data journalism will get there and we'll be able to really kind of maybe publish these appendices to the stories. Increasingly, we are in a sense, right? We are publishing a nerd box. We're publishing GitHub repos with the analysis code, with a lot of the scratch visualizations too. To me, that's very important to just kind of showcase to the subject matter experts, right? Well, here's what I did. Here's the code. I love open science and a lot of the stuff that's being done lately, where you can go examine the lexicon they use, the model that they built, and then maybe not always the raw data, especially when it comes to social media data, but at least you can get tweet IDs and resaturate those.
Yeah, definitely. I think at least I'm experiencing it more in my own work, and I think I'm seeing it more in computational research. It's like we're also limited by 8,000 words, and then there's just a huge appendix dump that can be longer than the article itself of every figure that's been cross-checked and whatnot. So I'd love to see more of that from data journalism as well. But my last question for you has to deal with your current project where you're tracking 15 congressional Twitter accounts. Kidding, 1,500 congressional Twitter accounts over the course of the 2022 midterm campaign. And so now that this is going to happen next month, in particular, what areas are you focusing on as we kind of roll into those midterms?
I wish I had a tidy answer, but it's far from tidy, right? It's messy. So one of the kind of broad findings, which probably aren't surprising to anyone, is just how much the campaign messaging, or at least on social media, is reflective of the news events that are driving, well, media coverage for sure, and then what those campaigns are talking about. So, for instance, while the Alito draft and the Dobbs decision resulted in a big spike in abortion messaging on the left and the right in terms of these candidates, that quickly kind of dropped off and returned on, the Republican side to the economy and inflation, and on the Democrat side as well, although a lot less in terms of a kind of total proportion of topics that they talk about. But then now we saw a spike, especially after the Martha's Vineyard stunt, in immigration rhetoric on both sides. So those aren't surprising trends, but it's cool to see in aggregate, in terms of the midterms field. But I don't have a tidy answer because I have sometimes a hard time separating what's an interesting, holistic, almost like, let's look at the whole midterm cycle, let's wait till it ends and kind of do an analysis of what was focused on in aggregate, which I think hews more towards what a research question would be for an academic, versus, what a lot of our political coverage looks like, which is what's happening this week and what can I extract from my data set. In this case, what tweets are going to be most illustrative of how the Republicans are staking out a position on immigration, right? Or like if, funding into TV ads on immigration is going up this much, and this is what it looks like, am I also seeing the same thing in the social media data that I have? So that's a balance there on like, how quickly can we turn a story using this data versus what's the kind of more holistic analysis we can do on this, which runs the risk of being dry, right?
Right, which I mean, as we talk, I find so many similarities with academia, and I think it's great that we're getting more of this computational looks in everyday journalism. So I wanted to kind of talk both about some of your research projects, but also the process behind it. I think it's super interesting, and I look forward to following the midterm coverage. So Aleszu, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your insights with us.
Michael, thank you so much for the invite and your interest in this, and look forward to keeping in touch on this stuff.
I've just been speaking with Aleszu Bajak, senior data reporter at USA Today. Check the episode description for a link to his website to read some of the stories we've been discussing. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next time, it'll be just me talking about the results of a recently published study on the emotions that politicians express in their Facebook and Instagram visuals and how audiences respond to these across different platforms. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Elmo. See you next time.